The night was unusually cold in the mountain region, and the wind howled as if carrying secrets from the forest. The small stone and wood cabin stood alone among the towering trees, its interior illuminated only by the golden glow of the fireplace. The scent of herbal tea filled the air, blending with the faint aroma of burning wood. Inside, Lunara, a young mother with a free spirit and a restless heart, watched her 2-year-old son, Ezren, playing with small wooden blocks on the wool rug. He was a peculiar child, with large, expressive eyes that always seemed to be observing the world differently, as if he could see something others couldn't. The peaceful silence of the night was suddenly broken by an unexpected sound. 3 firm, deliberate knocks echoed against the wooden door. Lunara froze. Who could be out there? They were completely isolated. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and she wasn't expecting any visitors. The wind couldn't have caused that sound. It was distinct, intentional, as if someone were seeking permission to enter. Ezren lifted his gaze. Intrigued, his curiosity piqued. Before Lunara could react, he was already on his feet, his small, unsteady legs carrying him toward the door. Lunara rushed forward and scooped him up before he could reach the handle. Her heart pounded. Could it be a lost traveler? An animal? 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind when another sound came from the other side. A low, raspy growl, almost like a whimper of pain. A shiver ran down her spine. She hesitated for a moment, but her innate curiosity and empathy won over. Moving cautiously, she unlatched the door and cracked it open, allowing only a sliver of warm light to escape into the cold darkness outside. And then she saw it. Standing in the pale moonlight was a colossal brown bear, just inches from the entrance. Its dark, deep-set eyes carried a silent plea. Beside it, a small cub trembled from the cold, pressing itself against its mother's massive paw. Their damp fur glistened under the moon, and it was in that moment that Lunara realized they were injured. The mother bear's hind leg bore a deep gash, and dirt clung to her muzzle, as if she had struggled to get there. Lunara's instincts screamed at her to shut the door immediately, but something in the bear's posture made her pause. The bear didn't roar, didn't attack, didn't move forward. She only stood there waiting. Her eyes, which should have inspired fear, held something else entirely. It was as if she were asking for help. Ezren, still cradled in his mother's arms, tilted his little head to the side, and to Lunara's shock, he stretched out his tiny hand toward the animal. His gaze held no fear, only empathy. Then, in his soft, innocent voice, he murmured something that no one could have expected. "Mama, she's asking to come in." What will Lunara do? Will she risk opening her home to this mysterious visitor? This story is just beginning. Lunara's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she stood frozen in the doorway, Ezren still nestled in her arms. The firelight behind her cast a soft glow on the mother bear's face, illuminating her weary eyes. She was watching, waiting, not with the hunger of a predator, but with the quiet patience of a creature that understood the difference between hostility and kindness. It was a silent request, a plea, and the cub, barely more than a bundle of damp fur, shivered violently at her feet. Everything in Lunara's instincts told her this was madness. A bear, no matter how desperate, was still a wild animal. One wrong move could turn this delicate moment into something catastrophic. And yet, something deep inside whispered that this was different, that this mother, wounded and exhausted, had nowhere else to go. The fact that she had come here to Ezren, meant something. Lunara tightened her grip on her son as a cold gust of wind slipped through the cracked door. If she did nothing, this animal and her cub would likely not survive the night. She looked down at Ezren. His wide, unblinking eyes remained fixed on the bear. There was no fear, only that same quiet understanding he always seemed to carry, as if he knew something she didn't. He reached out again, his tiny fingers grasping at the cold air between them and the towering figure outside. Lunara's heart clenched. How could she teach her son compassion if, in this moment, she turned her back on it? Steeling herself, she took a deep breath and made her decision. Slowly, carefully, She opened the door just a little wider. The mother bear didn't move at first, as if she, too, couldn't believe what was happening. Then, with excruciating gentleness, she took a hesitant step forward. The cub followed, its small paws hesitant on the wooden threshold. They didn't barge in. They didn't demand. They waited, respectful of the space they were being given. Lunara stepped back, her pulse hammering in her ears. This was insanity. But as the bear and her cub finally crossed into the warm glow of the cabin, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if it was fear, awe, or something deeper, something ancient. Then Ezren giggled, and for the first time, the mother bear let out a slow, low sound. Not a growl, but something softer. A hum, almost. A sound of gratitude. What will happen now? Can Lunara trust these unexpected guests? The night is far from over. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warm, golden glow. The mother bear stood just inside the doorway, her massive form casting flickering shadows along the walls. Lunara's hands trembled at her sides. She had done something unthinkable. She had let a bear into her home. Logic screamed that this was a mistake, that at any moment the animal could change, could decide that she and Ezren were prey instead of allies. But something about the way the bear moved, slow, deliberate, almost careful, kept her from stepping back. Ezren, still nestled in Lunara's arms, leaned forward, his small fingers stretching toward the bear's thick, damp fur. Lunara's breath hitched. She wanted to pull him back, to keep him from making contact, but before she could react, his tiny hand touched the bear's snout. A moment of absolute stillness followed. The mother bear's dark eyes met Ezren's, and she did not flinch. She did not growl or snap or retreat. Instead, she lowered her massive head, pressing her wet nose lightly against Ezren's palm. A shiver ran down Lunara's spine, not from fear, but from something stranger. Recognition. The cub, sensing its mother's acceptance, took hesitant steps forward. It was small, so small. Its legs wobbled as it tried to stand tall, but exhaustion weighed it down. Without thinking, Lunara knelt and reached out a cautious hand. The cub sniffed her fingertips before collapsing against her knee, too weak to stand any longer. Something was wrong. Lunara's fear gave way to concern. Now that she could see them up close, she noticed the mother bear's ribs pressing against her fur, the thinness of her limbs, the dried blood near her wound. She hadn't just come here seeking shelter. She had come here because she had no other choice. A storm of questions raged in Lunara's mind. How had she gotten hurt? Why had she come here of all places? And why was Ezren so unafraid, as if he had known this would happen? The boy turned his wide eyes to Lunara and simply said, "She's not bad, Mama. She's just tired." Lunara swallowed hard. Tired. That was an understatement. The bear and her cub were on the edge of collapse. If she turned them away now, they might not make it until morning. Slowly, cautiously, she made her decision. She pulled a thick wool blanket from the couch and spread it on the wooden floor near the fire. Then, she backed away, giving the bear space. The mother hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward. She sniffed the blanket, then collapsed onto it with a deep, exhausted sigh. The cub curled against her belly, and for the first time that night, Lunara saw it. The way the mother bear's body curled protectively around her child. The way she stayed alert even as sleep threatened to take her. She was just like Lunara, a mother, protecting her child. Lunara exhaled shakily and sat beside Ezren, watching the two creatures breathe, their bodies rising and falling in unison. The fear had not left her completely, but something else had taken its place. Trust. But what dangers had brought the bear to them? And would the night remain peaceful? The answers were waiting in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. The night stretched on in heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the slow, measured breathing of the mother bear and her cub. Lunara sat against the couch, arms wrapped around Ezren, who had curled up against her chest. She should have been afraid. Every survival instinct told her that she had made a reckless, dangerous mistake. And yet, there was an odd sense of peace in the room. The presence of the massive creature should have felt suffocating, overwhelming, but instead, it felt natural, as if this moment had been waiting to happen all along. Lunara's gaze flickered to the mother bear's wound. Now that the firelight illuminated it fully, she could see how deep it was. Not just a scrape from the wilderness, this was something else. The gash along her hind leg was jagged, raw, and disturbingly clean. A wound made by something unnatural. A blade? A trap? Lunara's stomach twisted. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. The storm was getting worse. Lunara's fingers tightened around Ezren's small frame. The bear had come here seeking safety. But from what? A low, shuddering breath filled the room. Not from Lunara, not from Ezren, but from the bear. Her massive body trembled slightly, her ears twitching toward the door as if expecting something. She was still afraid. Lunara's chest tightened. She had seen this kind of fear before, not in animals but in people. The kind of fear that lingers even when the immediate danger is gone. She thought of the times she had felt like this, cornered, desperate, running from something she couldn't fight. Ezren stirred against her, his tiny voice breaking the silence. "She's still listening, Mama." Lunara ran a hand through his soft curls. Listening to what? Ezren's sleepy eyes blinked up at her, thoughtful. To what's coming? A chill ran down Lunara's spine. She turned toward the window, peering out into the black abyss of the forest. Was something out there? The thought made her skin prickle. This wasn't just an injured bear seeking shelter. This was an animal that had been hunted. She rose carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. Something was wrong. The storm, the wound, the way the bear had knocked on her door instead of trying to hide in the woods. It all pointed to one unsettling truth. They weren't alone. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. If someone or something had forced the bear to flee here, how long would it take for them to come looking? Behind her, the bear exhaled softly, curling tighter around her cub. She was exhausted, barely clinging to consciousness. Whatever had happened to her, she had given everything to keep her baby safe. Lunara glanced at Ezren, who was watching her with quiet understanding. He didn't seem afraid. Should she be? Her hands balled into fists. No, she had let them in. That meant they were hers to protect now. Lunara strode toward the door, lifted the heavy wooden beam that served as a lock, and secured it into place. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was warmth, safety, promise. But for how long? The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin as if demanding to be let in. Lunara stood near the door, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. Something was out there. She could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the mother bear still twitched in her sleep, ears flicking toward every small sound. Ezren had drifted off in her arms, his small body warm and peaceful against her chest. How could he sleep so soundly in a moment like this? But then again, he had never shown fear. Not of the bear, not of the dark, not of the strange presence that now pressed against the edges of the night. Lunara swallowed hard and moved to the window, careful not to disturb the shadows that framed the glass. Outside, the world was black, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the treetops. And then she saw it. A movement, small at first, almost imperceptible, shifting between the trees. A trick of the wind? A broken branch swaying? No, something was there, watching, waiting. Her fingers instinctively tightened around Ezren. She had lived out here long enough to know the difference between a wandering animal and a patient predator. And whatever stood out there in the darkness, it was hunting. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Was this what the bear had been running from? Behind her, the mother bear stirred, letting out a low, restless rumble. Even in her exhausted state, she could feel it too. Lunara turned, eyes darting to the wound on the bear's leg. She hadn't gotten that gash from falling into a bush. Someone had done that to her. A crack echoed through the trees, a snapping branch. Lunara's breath hitched. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, human. The realization hit her like ice water. This wasn't just an animal being chased from its home. This was a hunt. She backed away from the window, careful not to make a sound. Whoever was out there, they were close. She had to think fast. The bear shifted again, trying to rise, but her body was weak. She let out a slow, painful exhale, and Lunara knew. If the people outside found them, the bear wouldn't be able to fight back, and neither would she. Her eyes darted to the rifle mounted on the wall. She hated using it, had always sworn that the only reason she kept it was for emergencies. But what else could she do? If she opened that door and the wrong person stood on the other side, Ezren stirred in her arms. "Mama," he mumbled sleepily. Lunara ran a hand through his hair, her heart hammering. "Shoo, baby, it's okay." But it wasn't, because then the doorknob turned. The metal doorknob twisted slowly, the faint creak of old iron barely audible over the roaring wind. Lunara's breath caught in her throat. This was no accident. Someone was there. Someone who didn't knock, didn't call out, just tested the door like they were checking a lock on a cage. Like they wanted in. She took a step back, clutching Ezren closer. The boy, still half asleep, nestled into her chest, unaware of the unseen presence just beyond the threshold. The firelight flickered, throwing restless shadows across the room. The mother bear stirred, lifting her massive head. Her ears twitched toward the sound, her dark eyes alert despite the exhaustion weighing down her body. She knew danger when she heard it. Another sound. Footsteps. A second pair, lighter than the first. There was more than one person outside. Hunters. The realization sent a cold shock through Lunara's spine. She had heard stories. Men who roamed these forests looking for sport, for trophies. They didn't care about life. They only cared about the chase. Lunara's fingers itched toward the rifle mounted on the wall, but she hesitated. Would they break in? Were they expecting a person? Or were they tracking the bear? If she made the wrong move, asterisk asterisk if she let them know she was inside. Asterisk asterisk they might see her as a witness, or worse, as prey. A voice, muffled by the wind, drifted through the door. Tracks lead here. A second voice, deeper, colder, answered. Then she's inside. Lunara's pulse pounded. They knew. A sudden shift, the bear moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but purposeful. She pushed herself onto her feet, her body swaying slightly as she braced against the pain in her wounded leg. Lunara felt something shift in the air. Not fear, not desperation, but defiance. The bear wasn't running anymore. She was ready. And then, a knock. Slow, deliberate, a taunt. Lunara's grip tightened around Ezren, who now stared wide-eyed at the door. His small fingers clutched at her sweater, and then, in a whisper so soft it barely reached her ears, he murmured, "They don't belong here." Lunara swallowed hard. He was right, and she had no intention of letting them in. Lunara's hands trembled as she adjusted her grip on Ezren. The knock echoed in her bones, slow and deliberate, like a hunter toying with his prey. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the low murmur of voices. They were waiting, testing her patience, enjoying the fear they thought she must be feeling. But they were wrong. She took a slow breath, pushing aside the terror clawing at her chest. Fear wouldn't save her. Fear wouldn't protect Ezren. She had spent years living in this cabin, learning the rhythm of the land, the way the wilderness moved. And one thing she knew for certain, when something threatened your home, you didn't run. You stood your ground. The mother bear shifted beside her, her massive frame steady despite the deep wound on her leg. Her dark eyes met Lunara's, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Two mothers, two protectors, both willing to fight for the lives that depended on them. The bear let out a low, controlled rumble. Not a growl of aggression, but a warning. Lunara moved quickly. She set Ezren down gently behind the couch, shielding him with the heavy furniture. "Stay here, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing his hair from his face. He didn't cry, didn't protest. He just nodded. Her next move was instinctive. She grabbed the rifle from the wall. The cold metal was heavy in her hands, a weight she despised but would not hesitate to use. She wouldn't fire unless she had to, but she needed them to know this was not their land, not their cabin, and she was no easy target. She stepped forward, keeping her back straight, her grip firm, and then finally she spoke. "Leave. Now." A pause. Then a chuckle from the other side of the door. Amused. Mocking. Then one of the voices said, "Or what?" The mother bear let out a sound then, low, deep, and full of promise. Lunara tightened her grip on the rifle. "Or you won't make it back to town." For a moment, there was only silence. A dangerous silence. The kind that stretched between predator and prey just before the attack. Lunara's pulse pounded in her ears as she stood firm, the rifle heavy in her hands. She could feel their hesitation. The hunters hadn't expected resistance. Not from a woman alone in the woods, certainly not one who spoke with such certainty. And they had no idea about the bear. The mother bear took a slow step forward, her massive shadow stretching across the cabin floor. Her breathing was deep, measured, but her eyes never left the door. She was waiting for Lunara's command, for a reason to fight, or simply because she, too, knew what was at stake. Then a second knock, louder this time, sharper, a warning. One of the men outside spoke again, his voice colder now. "That's a big mistake, lady." Lunara's hands clenched around the rifle. She knew what this was, a test. They wanted to see if she would break, if she would fold under the pressure and give them what they wanted. But she had spent years surviving in these woods, learning the language of the wild. And there was one rule every creature understood. If you make yourself prey, you become prey. She stepped closer to the door, heart hammering, and leveled the rifle at the wood. They couldn't see it, but they would hear it. And that was enough. Click. She pulled back the bolt, loading a round into the chamber. The sound cut through the storm outside like a blade. No hesitation. No bluff. "You have 10 seconds, she said, her voice like stone. Then I stopped counting. For the first time, the men hesitated. They hadn't expected a fight. Then, footsteps retreating. A pause. Curse. And then, finally, the sound of boots crunching through the snow, growing fainter. They were leaving. Lunara didn't move. Not yet. She waited, muscles tight, listening to the forest, to the wind. The mother bear remained at her side, still as stone, her breathing slow and steady. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Ezren's small voice broke the silence. "They're gone." Lunara exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For now, the wind outside howled, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin like a warning. Lunara remained motionless, her body rigid, listening for any sign that the hunters had truly left. But the silence felt wrong. It was too heavy, too expectant, like the breath before a storm. She tightened her grip on the rifle, her heart still hammering from the confrontation. They had backed away, yes, but she didn't believe for a second that they had given up. Men like that didn't leave empty-handed. She turned her gaze to the mother bear, who stood watching the door, her massive body tense despite her exhaustion. She didn't trust the quiet either. Her cub nestled against her leg, small and fragile, unaware of the danger that still lingered just beyond the cabin walls. Lunara had never believed in fate, but this night felt too strange, too deliberate to be chance. What had led this bear to her door? And why did she, of all people, feel compelled to protect her? Ezren, sitting cross-legged by the fire, stared at the bear with an expression far too wise for a child his age. "She didn't run," he said softly, as if speaking a truth only he could see. His small fingers traced invisible patterns on the wooden floor, deep in thought. "She knew you'd help her, Mama." Lunara's breath caught in her throat. Was that possible? Had the bear truly come here not just out of desperation, but because she somehow knew she would be safe? It was absurd. Wild animals didn't seek out humans for protection. And yet, she thought of the way the bear had knocked, the way she had waited at the door instead of forcing her way in, the way she had looked at Lunara not with fear, but with hope. The realization sent a shiver through her. Humans and animals were meant to be separate, their worlds divided by instinct and survival. But tonight, that barrier had crumbled.
Then, a sound. A metallic clink, barely audible over the wind, but distinct enough to freeze Lunara in place. It wasn't the sound of the storm. She turned sharply toward the window, her pulse hammering. Through the swirling snow, a shadow moved between the trees. Her stomach twisted. They hadn't left. They were waiting, watching. She clenched her jaw, her body tightening with resolve. They weren't done, but neither was she. Lunara's grip on the rifle tightened as she stepped away from the window. She had been right. Those men hadn't left. They were still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for her to let her guard down. But she wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever. The mother bear let out a low rumble, her ears twitching toward the sounds outside. She knew the danger hadn't passed. Though her body was weak, her instincts were sharp. She was ready to fight if she had to. Her cub whimpered, pressing itself against her massive paw, and Lunara felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. These men had chased a mother and her child to the edge of death, and now, even after being warned, they were still out there. Hunting. Ezren, still curled up behind the couch, watched her with those wide, knowing eyes. He wasn't afraid. That should have unsettled her, but instead, it steadied her. She couldn't afford fear. Not now. She exhaled slowly and moved toward the door. Another sound. A crunch in the snow. Closer this time. They were testing her patience, seeing if she would break. She wouldn't. She lifted the rifle and pressed the barrel against the door. Her voice was steady, cold. "I warned you." A pause. Then, laughter. A voice called out, mocking. "Lady, you don't understand what you're protecting." Lunara's heart pounded. What did that mean? Before she could ask, the mother bear shifted, stepping forward until her massive form was nearly beside Lunara. Her eyes, dark and deep as the forest, met Lunara's for just a moment. And then she moved. With a powerful shove, the bear pushed the door open herself. The wind roared through the cabin, sending snow swirling into the warmth of the firelight. Lunara raised the rifle, but she didn't need to fire. The sight before her was enough. The hunters stood at the tree line, their weapons raised. But as soon as the bear emerged, everything changed. The leader, a tall man with a scar cutting across his jaw, stumbled back. His face paled, his grip on his rifle faltering. He wasn't just startled, he was afraid. Then, his partner grabbed his arm, voice frantic. "No, we're done." The scarred man hesitated. He looked from the bear to Lunara, as if realizing, truly realizing, who he was up against. And then, without another word, they turned and disappeared into the woods. Lunara stood frozen, her breath coming in sharp bursts. It was over. The mother bear watched them go, her body still tense, still prepared for battle. But when the last shadow vanished between the trees, she finally exhaled. And so did Lunara. She lowered the rifle, stepping back inside. The bear followed. Not because she was weak. Not because she needed anything more from Lunara. But because, for just this one night, this was home. Ezren peeked out from behind the couch, his small voice filled with certainty. "I told you, Mama. She belongs here." Lunara knelt beside him, brushing his hair back, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. Maybe he was right. She turned back to the bear, who had already curled up near the fire again, her cub safely tucked against her side. She had fought her battle. Now she could rest. And for the first time in a long, long while, so could Lunara.